Hello Guy, welcome back to my new channel. In the heart of what was once the most powerful empire the world had ever known, a silent testament to its genius still stands. Carved into landscapes, striding across valleys on elegant legs of stone, are the remnants of a system that was nothing less than the lifeblood of a civilization. We often think of Rome in terms of its legions, its emperors, and its grand political dramas. But beneath the surface of that history flows a quieter, more fundamental story. The story of water. This is the story of the Roman aqueducts, an engineering marvel so profound that it shaped the very destiny of the city and its empire. It's a tale not just of arches and channels, but of ambition, mathematics, and an obsessive quest to conquer nature, not through force but through understanding. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before the first stone of the first great aqueduct was ever laid, Rome was a city defined by a single vital river, the Tiber. For the early Romans, the Tiber was everything. It was a source of water for drinking, for washing, for agriculture. It was a natural defense, a commercial highway, and a spiritual entity, personified by the god Tiberinus. The city's legendary founding, with the twins Romulus and Remus set adrift on its waters, is inextricably linked to the river. In its infancy, Rome, like countless other settlements throughout history, clung to this natural water source, as a child clings to its mother. The early population drew its water directly from the river, or from nearby springs like the spring of Juturna in the Forum, and from shallow wells dug into the soil. For a small hilltop settlement of shepherds and farmers, this was sufficient. It was a simple, direct relationship with the immediate environment, a cycle of life dictated by the river's moods, its gentle flow in the dry season, and its destructive floods in the wet. But Rome was not destined to remain a small settlement. As its political and military influence grew with terrifying speed, so did its population. The Republic, hungry and ambitious, expanded first throughout the Italian peninsula and then beyond, and with each conquest wealth, slaves, and new citizens flooded into the capital. The once modest cluster of hills began to transform into a sprawling, densely populated urban centre, a magnet for the entire Mediterranean world. By the 4th century BC, the population was likely well over 100,000 people, a staggering figure for the era. The simple methods of water collection that had served the early Romans were now being strained to their absolute limit. The Tiber, once a source of life, was becoming a grave problem. As the city grew, so did its waste. The river became a convenient dumping ground for all manner of refuse, from household garbage to industrial waste from workshops and tanneries. The construction of the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer of Rome, was a monumental feat of early engineering in its own right, but its primary function was to drain the marshy lowlands between the hills and carry waste away from the city centre, ultimately depositing it directly into the very same river from which many people were still drawing their drinking water. The implications for public health were, by modern standards, catastrophic. The water would have been a thick, brown soup of contaminants. Disease would have been rampant, a constant and invisible threat stalking the crowded alleyways. Typhoid, cholera, and dysentery would have flourished, leading to high mortality rates, especially among the young and the elderly. The quality of life for the average Roman was directly and negatively impacted by the increasingly polluted state of their primary water source. The city was becoming a victim of its own success, choking on its own filth. The local springs were insufficient for the growing demand, and the shallow wells often yielded brackish, unpalatable water that was easily contaminated by seepage from the ground. This was more than an inconvenience. It was an existential threat. A city that cannot provide clean water for its citizens cannot grow. It cannot maintain public order. It cannot field healthy armies. It cannot project power. The leaders of the Roman Republic, men of immense practicality and ambition, men who thought in terms of generations, not just election cycles, understood this implicitly. The problem of water was not just a matter of sanitation, It was a matter of statecraft, of ensuring the stability and continued dominance of Rome itself. They needed a new solution, a revolutionary one, that could bypass the polluted Tiber and deliver a source of pure, clean water into the very heart of their burgeoning metropolis. This pressing, desperate need was the fertile ground from which the idea of the aqueducts would spring. The Romans, for all their ingenuity, did not invent the concept of the aqueduct from scratch. The idea of transporting water over long distances was an ancient one, a challenge faced by many civilizations before them. They were, above all, masters of observation and adaptation, rarely inventing from a complete vacuum, but instead perfecting and scaling up the ideas of those who came before them. They looked to the east and saw the incredible works of the Assyrians, who had constructed impressive canals to irrigate their lands and supply their great cities. The Assyrian king Sennacherib, for instance, built a massive 50-mile-long canal to bring water to his capital Nineveh around 700 BC. This project even included a 300-meter-wide aqueduct bridge at Jowan, built with over 2 million stone blocks. The Romans were also aware of the hydraulic engineering of the Greeks, whom they increasingly admired and conquered. A prime example was the tunnel of Eupailenos on the island of Samos. This remarkable 1-kilometer tunnel, dug through a mountain in the 6th century BC, was a marvel of surveying and construction, designed to supply the city with water from a hidden spring, protecting it from potential besiegers. They may also have been influenced by the Etruscans, their sophisticated neighbors in Italy, who were masters of drainage and hydraulic engineering, known for their cuniculi, or small underground water channels. The Romans absorbed these precedents, recognizing the potential to apply these principles on a scale never before imagined, driven by a need that was far greater than that of any city that had come before. The first decisive step in this grand journey was taken in 3112 BC, a period of intense conflict for the Republic, particularly the Second Samnite War. The man responsible was Appius Claudius Caecus, a censor of Rome and one of the great builders and visionaries of his era. He was a man who understood that infrastructure was power. In the same year he began construction on the famous Appian Way, the great military road that would project Roman power south. He recognized that to secure Rome's future he needed to secure its water. He commissioned the city's very first aqueduct, the Aqua Appia. Compared to the colossal structures that would follow, the Aqua Appia was a modest affair. It ran for a little over 16 kilometers, or about 10 miles, but its design was brilliantly strategic. For almost its entire length it was built as a subterranean channel, hidden from view. This was a deliberate and crucial choice. Rome was still vulnerable to attack. The Samnite Wars were a bitter struggle, and an above-ground aqueduct would have been an obvious and easy target for an enemy army, which could simply smash the channel and cut the city's water supply, bringing it to its knees through thirst. By burying the channel, Appius Claudius ensured its protection. The construction was a statement of intent. It was the Republic investing in long-term infrastructure, thinking not just about the next battle, but about the next generation. It brought fresh spring water from the Sabine Hills to a distribution point in the Forum Boarium, the city's bustling cattle market, providing a clean, reliable alternative to the Tiber and marking a pivotal moment in Roman urban development. It was a promise of a cleaner, healthier future. The success of the Aqua Appia opened the floodgates, both literally and figuratively. 40 years later, in 2072 BC, with the wars against Pyrrhus of Epirus won, and Rome's control over southern Italy secured, the city commissioned its second aqueduct, the Aqua Annio Vetus. This was a far more ambitious project. It was over 4 times longer than the Appia, stretching for some 64 kilometers, or 40 miles. It drew its water not from a spring, but directly from the Annio River, a tributary of the Tiber, much further upstream where the water was cleaner. This provided a much greater volume of water, necessary for the still-growing city, but its quality was not as pure as the spring-fed Appia. After storms, the river water would become cloudy with sediment, a problem that would plague this aqueduct throughout its life. Like the Appia, the Annio Vetus also ran almost entirely underground, its route tracing the contours of the land in a winding path. Security was still a primary concern. Together, these first 2 aqueducts established a fundamental principle. Rome would no longer be limited by the water within its immediate vicinity. It would reach out, like the tentacles of an octopus, deep into the surrounding countryside to claim the water it needed. This concept of reaching far into the landscape to fundamentally reshape the urban environment was revolutionary in its scale and ambition. The construction of these early, subterranean aqueducts taught the Romans valuable lessons. They honed their skills in surveying, in digging tunnels through varied terrain, and in creating waterproof channels using hydraulic mortar. But the true golden age of aqueduct construction, the moment when function met monumental art, began in 1404 BC with the building of the Aqua Marcia. This project marked a significant shift in scale, technology, and public statement. The Marcia was longer still, over 91 kilometers, or 57 miles. But its most important feature was the quality of its water. It tapped into pristine, ice-cold springs high in the mountains near the source of the Anio River, and the water it delivered to Rome was renowned for its purity, clarity, and taste. The historian Pliny the Elder would later describe it as clarissima aquarum omnium, the clearest of all waters, and a gift of the gods to the city. To bring this exceptional water to Rome, the engineers had to overcome immense topographical challenges. For the first time, a significant portion of the aqueduct, the final 11 kilometers as it approached the city, was carried not underground, but high atop a series of magnificent stone arches. This was a profound change, driven by necessity and a newfound confidence. The terrain approaching Rome, the Campagna, was not a simple downhill slope. It was a wide, flat plain. To maintain the precise, gentle gradient required for the water to flow by gravity, the channel had to be kept at a high elevation across this plain. Building a massive earthen rampart for miles was impractical and unstable, so the engineers turned to the arch. The arch was the key structural innovation that allowed the Romans to build higher, stronger, and with less material than any previous civilization. By using a series of arches, they could stride across low-lying valleys and plains, keeping the water channel at its required height, with an elegance and permanence that was breathtaking. The Aqua Marcia was not just a utility, it was a triumphant statement. Its towering arches, visible for miles, were a powerful symbol of Rome's wealth, its engineering prowess, and its complete mastery over the natural world. They announced to every traveler approaching the city that they were entering the domain of a civilization that did not just conquer its enemies, but could bend nature itself to the will of the city. The arrival of the Aqua Marcia and its abundant, high-quality water had a transformative effect on Roman life. It was at this point that the concept of water as a public luxury, not just a bare necessity, began to take hold. The water was used to supply the first major public baths, which would evolve into the grand, opulent thermae that became central to Roman social life. It fed ornate public fountains that became gathering places and decorative features of the urban landscape. For the first time, the wealthy began to pay for private connections to their homes, a status symbol that advertised their connection to the city's new prosperity. The state's ability to provide this amenity became a cornerstone of its relationship with the populace. This concept was formalized in the role of the cura aquarum, the magistrate responsible for overseeing the water supply. It was a prestigious and powerful position, later consolidated under the emperor himself, highlighting the immense political importance of the aqueducts. Providing water was a way for leaders from republican generals who funded construction with the spoils of war, to later emperors, to curry favor with the people, to demonstrate their beneficence, liberalitas, and to leave a lasting legacy imprinted on the city's very fabric. The phrase panem et circendos, bread and circuses, is famous, but the unspoken third element, aqua, was arguably the most fundamental of all. As the Republic gave way to the Empire in the 1st century BC, the pace and scale of aqueduct construction only accelerated. The first Emperor Augustus, operating through his trusted right-hand man, the brilliant and energetic Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, oversaw a massive expansion and renovation of the entire water system. Agrippa, serving as a dial in 33 BC, treated the water supply as his personal mission. He was a force of nature, a one-man ministry of public works. He repaired the crumbling Aqua Appia and Arnio Vetus and cleansed the Aqua Marcia. Not content with that, he built two entirely new aqueducts for the city, the Aqua Julia in 33 BC and the Aqua Virgo in 19 BC. The Aqua Virgo is particularly noteworthy. It was designed specifically to supply the baths of Agrippa, the first of the great imperial thermae, built in the Campus Martius. Its name, according to a charming legend recorded by Frontinus, comes from a young maiden Virgo who showed the thirsty Roman soldiers the source of the pristine spring. It was renowned for its soft, pure water. A significant section of the Aqua Virgo still functions today, over 2,000 years later, a living link to the age of Augustus, its waters now feeding the world's most famous fountain, the Trevi Fountain. Subsequent emperors continued this tradition, each seeking to add their own mark to the city's water supply, and thereby secure their legacy. The megalomaniacal emperor Caligula began 2 aqueducts that were later completed by his successor Claudius in 52 AD. These were the titans of the Roman system, the Aqua Claudia and the Anio Novus. The Aqua Claudia stretched for nearly 70 kilometers, 43 miles, drawing from springs of excellent quality near the source of the Marcia. Its arches, some reaching over 30 meters or 100 feet in height, are among the most impressive and photogenic of all the ruins that survive today, marching across the Roman Campagna in a display of raw power. It was built concurrently with the Anio Novus, which was even longer and carried the greatest volume of water of any of the aqueducts. However, drawing its water from the Anio River, its quality was often poor and sediment-laden. The engineers attempted to mitigate this by building a series of settling tanks, or piscinae lamariae, near the source, allowing silt to settle out before the water entered the main channel. The sight of these 2 great aqueducts, running for miles on the same set of arches, with the channel of the Anio Novus physically placed on top of the channel of the Aqua Claudia, must have been one of the ancient world's most awe-inspiring spectacles as they entered the city at the Porta Maggiore. By the early 2nd century AD, at the height of the empire under emperors like Trajan who added the Aqua Traiana in 1009 AD, Rome was supplied by no fewer than 11 major aqueducts. These engineering marvels snaked their way across the landscape from every direction, converging on the city like the spokes of a giant wheel. Together they delivered a staggering amount of water into the city each day. Estimates vary, but a widely accepted conservative figure is around 1 million cubic meters of water, or 264 million gallons, every 24 hours. To put that in perspective, this is more water per capita than is supplied to many modern cities today. This vast quantity of water completely redefined the urban landscape and the Roman way of life. It enabled the existence of the colossal imperial baths of Caracalla and Diocletian, vast leisure complexes that could accommodate thousands of people at a time. It flushed the public latrines, dramatically improving sanitation. It supplied thousands of public fountains, ensuring that even the poorest Roman had access to free, clean water. It powered fountains, turned water wheels for milling grain, and irrigated the lavish gardens of the wealthy. Rome had become a city of water, a city whose very sounds were defined by the constant splashing of fountains and the rush of water through lead pipes. This was the culmination of a process that began with a simple, desperate need. The thirst of an empire, born from a polluted river and a growing population, had driven the Romans to innovate on an unprecedented scale. They moved from simple wells to hidden underground channels, and finally to the glorious, sky-striding arched bridges that have become their enduring symbol. Each aqueduct was a response to a specific need, an improvement on the last, and a lesson learned. The journey from the Aqua Appia to the Aqua Claudia was a journey of increasing confidence, ambition, and technical mastery. It was a system built not by a single genius, but by generations of anonymous engineers, surveyors, masons, and laborers, all working towards a common goal. They were not just building a utility, they were building the very idea of Rome as a grand, eternal city. They had solved the problem of thirst, and in doing so, had created a legacy in stone and water that would outlast the empire itself. The foundations had been laid both literally in the ground and conceptually in the minds of Roman engineers. The stage was now set for the even more complex tasks of planning, surveying, and harnessing the materials that would turn these audacious visions into reality. The empire was thirsty, and the engineers of Rome were about to provide it with an endless drink. This initial phase, from the problem to the grand solution, represents the birth of an idea. It shows a civilization identifying a fundamental weakness and dedicating immense resources and intellectual capital to overcoming it. The evolution from the subterranean Aqua Appia to the monumental Aqua Claudia is a perfect microcosm of Rome's own evolution from a regional power to the master of the Mediterranean world. The structures grew in size, in confidence, and in public visibility, mirroring the trajectory of the Republic and Empire. The need for water was the catalyst, but the result was far more than a simple plumbing system. It was the creation of a new kind of urbanism, one predicated on an abundance of a resource that most cities in history had struggled to find. The Roman state's commitment to the cura aquarum demonstrated a profound understanding of the link between infrastructure, public health, and political stability. Before a single arch could be designed or a single trench could be dug, this foundational understanding had to be in place. The thirst of the empire was not just for water, but for order, for grandeur, and for a permanence that could defy the ages. The aqueducts were the answer to all of these desires, a promise of a better, cleaner, and more magnificent life, delivered from a distant mountain spring directly into the heart of Rome. This was the genesis, the moment when necessity met ambition, and the grand design began to take shape. The monumental arches of a Roman aqueduct are what capture the imagination. They are a declaration of power written in stone against the sky, an indelible feature of the Roman legacy. But they are merely the most visible expression, the final triumphant sentence of a far deeper and more complex story. A story of quiet genius that unfolded long before the first foundation was laid, before a single block of stone was quarried, or a single spade of earth was turned. A colossal intellectual effort took place, both in the administrative heart of Rome and across the rugged, unforgiving landscapes of the Italian countryside. This was the invisible work, the meticulous planning, surveying, and logistical preparation that formed the true foundation of these incredible structures. The success of an aqueduct depended not on the brute force of a legion, but on the quiet precision of a mathematician, the keen eye of a surveyor, and an intimate, almost spiritual understanding of the land. It was a battle of wits against terrain, and the Roman engineers had a small but highly effective arsenal of tools and techniques at their disposal to win it. The entire system, from a simple channel dug into the earth to a multi-tiered bridge striding across a valley, was predicated on one simple, beautiful, and unforgiving principle: gravity. The water had to flow continuously, downhill, from a source often dozens of miles away, to its destination in the city. This required the creation of a channel with a constant, gentle, downward slope, a gradient so subtle it was often imperceptible to the naked eye. The margin for error was vanishingly small. If the slope was too steep, the rushing water would behave like a liquid abrasive, scouring and eroding the waterproof lining and masonry, its relentless power threatening to tear the structure apart from the inside over years of operation. If the slope was too shallow, the water would stagnate, becoming a sluggish, dead pool where sediment would precipitate, algae and weeds would grow, and the precious supply would become fouled and undrinkable. The ideal gradient was a delicate, masterful balance, a testament to the surveyor's skill and the cornerstone of the entire grand design. The entire process began with the single most critical decision: selecting the source, the caput aqueducts. This was not a casual choice. It was a science of observation and deduction, a blend of practical geology and folk wisdom. Roman engineers, the architecti, would spend considerable time in the field, acting as prospectors for water, reading the landscape like a sacred text. They looked for telltale signs of a reliable and pure source. They observed the clarity of springs as they bubbled from the earth, noting their temperature and rate of flow throughout the seasons to ensure they would not run dry in the heat of summer. They studied the health and vibrancy of the vegetation growing nearby, understanding that lush green plants were a sign of a constant water source. They even paid close attention to the physical condition of the local inhabitants, the shepherds and farmers who drank from that water daily. The great Roman architect and engineer Marcus Vitruvius Pollio, writing in the 1st century BC in his seminal 10-volume work De Architectura, provides a detailed account of this vital process. He advises surveyors to observe the local people, checking for clear complexions, sound health, and no inflamed eyes, as these were indicators of wholesome water. In a more direct and rather grim method of analysis, he suggests a form of primitive bioassay, examining the livers of animals that grazed in the area and drank from the local water. If the dissected liver appeared healthy and untainted, it was considered a strong sign of pure, safe water. This was empirical science in its rawest form. The engineers would conduct their own direct tests as well. They would taste the water, of course, assessing its sweetness and lack of brackish flavor. They would boil it in a clean bronze vessel, checking carefully to see if it left behind a residue of sand, mud, or other impurities. They would sprinkle vegetables in it and see how quickly they cooked. Another practical test of the water's softness or mineral content. They would even check to see if the water itself would corrode the bronze vessel, a sign of undesirable acidity. The ideal source was a high-altitude spring, which offered two key advantages that made it worth the effort of reaching. First, the water was naturally filtered through layers of rock and sand on its journey from the subterranean aquifer to the surface, emerging in a state of exceptional purity. Second, its high elevation provided the necessary potential energy, the head, to begin the long, gravity-powered journey to the city below, giving the engineers the vertical drop they needed to work with over many miles. Choosing the right source was half the battle won. A poor source, no matter how brilliantly engineered the channel, would deliver poor water, defeating the entire purpose of the colossal undertaking. Once a suitable source was identified and certified, the monumental task of plotting the course began. The goal was to find the most efficient route that could maintain the required gentle gradient. This rarely, if ever, meant a straight line. A straight line is the human mind's ideal, but the Earth is not ideal. The aqueduct's path would have to be a masterpiece of compromise, a sinuous line that meandered for miles, hugging the contours of the land like a river, looping around hills, and crossing valleys at their narrowest and most advantageous points. The Roman surveyor, the agrimensor or grammaticus, was a master of topography. His primary tools were simple in design but remarkably effective in skilled hands. For establishing straight lines and right angles, especially for mapping out land and the footprint of construction sites, he used a groma. This instrument consisted of a vertical staff with a horizontal cross at the top, from which 4 plumb bobs, or perpendicular, were suspended on strings. By sighting along the strings of the plumb bobs, the surveyor could lay out a perfectly straight line or a precise 90-degree angle. It was the essential tool for creating the grid-like order of a Roman military camp or a new colonial town, but it was less suited for the primary task of an aqueduct surveyor, precision leveling over long distances. For that, the Romans relied on their most crucial surveying instrument, the device that made the aqueducts possible, the chorobates. This was the precision tool that translated the abstract concept of a perfect gradient into a series of marks on the ground. The chorobates was an impressive piece of equipment, a long wooden beam, perhaps 20 feet in length, supported by 2 sturdy legs at either end, which were reinforced with diagonal struts. Atop the main beam was a long, finely carved channel, or groove. The surveyor would fill this channel with water. If the water level touched the top edges of the channel consistently along its entire length, the instrument was perfectly level. It was, in essence, a large and highly accurate spirit level, resistant to the minor errors that could plague smaller devices. For use on windy days when the water in the groove might be disturbed by ripples, a series of plumb lines were hung from the sides of the beam. When these lines hung perfectly perpendicular to the beam, as checked against inscribed vertical lines on the frame, it also indicated a level position. The choroboles was a robust, reliable, and ingeniously simple tool, capable of extraordinary accuracy in the hands of a patient expert. The process of surveying the line was painstaking and laborious. The surveyors would work in teams, leapfrogging the instrument across the landscape. They would set up the chorobates, ensure it was perfectly level, and then have an assistant move ahead with a graduated staff, or rod. The lead surveyor would peer through sighting plates on the chorobates, much like the sights on a rifle, and take a reading on the distant staff. By recording the height on the staff, they could determine the difference in elevation between the 2 points. They would then move the chorobates to the staff's position, and repeat the process, again and again, thousands upon thousands of times, over dozens of miles of often difficult terrain. Each measurement was meticulously recorded on wax tablets. They were slowly, methodically, creating a precise topographical map of the route, a dataset that would determine the final design. The level of precision they achieved is simply staggering to the modern mind. The average gradient for many Roman aqueducts was between 100,000. The famous Pont du Gard in southern France, a section of the Aqueduct of Nimes, is a masterpiece of this precision. Over its entire 50-kilometre length, the aqueduct drops only about 12 metres in total. The bridge section itself, spanning nearly 300 metres, has a gradient of only 2.5 centimetres, a slope so slight it is almost perfectly flat, a ratio of 1 in 18,241. To have achieved this with the naked eye, plumb bobs and a wooden beam filled with water, is a profound testament to the skill, the patience and the methodical, almost obsessive nature of the Roman engineer. This precision was the secret ingredient, the invisible magic that made the entire system work. Once the route was surveyed and marked out with stakes, the legal and logistical planning began, a phase that showcased the bureaucratic sophistication of the Roman state. Building an aqueduct was not just an engineering project, it was a massive state undertaking, a display of imperial power and civic responsibility. The proposed route would often cross private land, fields, vineyards and farms that were the livelihood of Roman citizens. To address this, the state had to secure a legal right-of-way. Roman law, ever precise, was very specific about this. According to the Lex Quinctia of 9 BC, a law dedicated to the regulation of aqueducts, a wide corridor of land, typically 15 feet on either side of the aqueduct, was to be kept clear of all trees, vines and buildings. This was not just to facilitate construction, but to create a permanent protective buffer zone, preventing damage from tree roots, falling trees, or farmers ploughing too close to the foundations. Landowners were compensated for the seizure of their property, and all transactions were meticulously documented, a clear sign of a sophisticated bureaucratic state at work. The financing for these projects was immense, far beyond the means of any private individual. They were funded by the state treasury, aerarium, often supplemented directly by the spoils of war, manubia. The construction of the Aqua Marcia, for example, was paid for with treasure seized during the final conquests of Carthage and Corinth, literally transforming the wealth of defeated enemies into life-giving water for Rome. This demonstrates how military success directly fueled domestic development and infrastructure, a powerful cycle of conquest and construction that built the empire. With the legality settled and the funding secured, the focus shifted to the physical materials. The Romans were masters of logistics and material science, and they selected their building materials with a combination of practicality and an eye for permanence. The primary structure of the channel and the arches was typically built from stone or, more commonly, brick-faced concrete. Local quarries would be identified and established all along the proposed route to minimize the immense challenge of transporting millions of tons of stone. The stone blocks were often rough-hewn at the quarry to reduce their weight before being loaded onto heavy ox-drawn carts for their slow journey to the construction site. There, they would be finished by skilled masons, ready to be lifted into place. For the sections built with arches, massive wooden scaffolding and centering would be erected first. The wedge-shaped stones of the arch, the voussoirs, would be carefully laid over this temporary wooden frame. The final central stone, the keystone, would be driven into place at the top, locking all the other stones into place through the powerful and elegant force of compression. Once the mortar was set, the wooden frame could be carefully dismantled and reused for the next arch in the sequence, an efficient, modular process that allowed them to march across the landscape. However, the most important material, the true secret weapon of Roman construction that made so much possible, was their revolutionary invention, opus caementectium, or Roman concrete. This was not the same as modern Portland cement concrete, and in some ways it was superior. The Roman version was a mixture of lime mortar, water, and an aggregate of stones or rubble. The magic ingredient, the catalyst for its unique properties, was a particular type of volcanic sand known as pozzolana. This sand, found in abundance in the region around Naples and the great volcano of Vesuvius, was rich in silica and alumina. When this volcanic ash was mixed with lime and water, it underwent a chemical reaction, forming a calcium-aluminium silicate hydrate compound. This created a binder of exceptional strength, durability, and most remarkably, the ability to set and harden even underwater. This made it a hydraulic material, perfect for building bridge piers in the middle of rushing rivers, for constructing the massive breakwaters of harbours like Caesarea Maritima, and, crucially, for waterproofing the water channels of the aqueducts. Roman concrete was cheap, it was versatile, and it was incredibly strong. It could be laid by less skilled labour, unlike the fine-cut ashlar masonry that required expert masons. The Romans would often use it as a structural core, faced with more attractive brick, opus testaceum, or diamond-shaped stones, opus reticulatum, creating a composite structure of immense strength and resilience that was also aesthetically pleasing. The water channel itself, the Specius, had to be perfect. Any leaks would not only lose precious water, but could also, over time, saturate and weaken the masonry of the structure, leading to its eventual and catastrophic collapse. To prevent this, the Romans lined the entire channel with a special waterproof mortar called opus sininum. This was another Roman innovation, a recipe refined over centuries, made by mixing the standard lime mortar with crushed terracotta tiles, pottery shards, or bricks. The crushed ceramic fragments, rich in silica themselves, acted as a pozzolanic material, reacting with the lime to create a denser, less permeable mortar. It also reduced shrinkage and cracking as the mortar cured. This lining, a practical and effective solution, gave the channel a distinctive reddish, pebbly appearance, a feature found in the ruins of aqueducts, cisterns, and baths across the entire empire. The application of this lining was a skilled job. Workers would apply several layers, often to a total thickness of several inches, polishing the final surface to a smooth finish to ensure the water would flow with minimal friction. This created a seamless, waterproof conduit for the precious cargo, a channel within a channel, for the final distribution of water within the city, particularly for private connections where the water needed to be under pressure. The Romans used pipes. The most common material for these pipes was lead. Lead was abundant as a byproduct of silver smelting in provinces like Britannia and Hispania. It was relatively easy to work with, and it could be formed into pipes of various diameters. Roman plumbers, the plumbarii, would cast flat rectangular sheets of lead of a standard size, then roll them into a cylindrical shape and solder the seam shut, often creating a pear-shaped cross-section with the thick solder line at the top. These lead pipes, or fistulae, were mass-produced in standard lengths and diameters. They were often inscribed with the name of the property owner and the official who granted the connection, a measure to control the rampant problem of illegal water siphoning. While the health risks of lead are well known today, the Roman understanding of lead poisoning, or plumbism, was limited. However, the debate on its impact continues. Many scholars argue that because the water in the aqueducts was constantly flowing and was often hard water, rich in calcium carbonate, the build-up of mineral scale sinter on the inside of the pipes would have quickly created a protective layer, minimizing the amount of lead that leached into the water. In some cases, especially where high pressure was not a concern, pipes made of terracotta or even hollowed-out stone or wood were also used as cheaper alternatives. The planning phase also involved a deep, practical understanding of hydraulic principles. While the Romans did not have a complete theoretical understanding of fluid dynamics in the modern sense, they never formulated an equivalent of Bernoulli's principle. Their practical knowledge gained through generations of trial and error was immense and highly effective. They knew, for instance, that water pressure increased with depth, a phenomenon they had to master when crossing deep valleys. When a gorge was simply too deep or wide to be spanned by a bridge of arches, they employed a remarkable and daring technique known as the inverted siphon. Instead of crossing the valley high in the air, the aqueduct would descend one side of the valley in a series of strong, reinforced pipes. These pipes would run across the valley floor, often supported by a low bridge called a venter to keep them level, and then run up the other side to a receiving tank just slightly lower in elevation than the entry point. The water, pushed by the hydrostatic pressure from the column of water on the descending side, would be forced through the U-shaped siphon and up the other side, rejoining the conventional gravity-fed channel. This was a triumph of practical engineering, but it was fraught with challenges. The pressure at the bottom of the siphon could be immense, up to 10 atmospheres or more, requiring incredibly strong pipes and perfectly sealed joints to prevent catastrophic bursting. The Romans often built the siphons with multiple, smaller parallel pipes made of thick lead, sometimes soldering them together or encasing them in concrete or stone to provide extra support. They also understood the problem of air getting trapped in the pipes, which could cause blockages and impede flow. To counter this, they sometimes included vents and release valves, colluviaria, at the lowest point of the siphon to manage airlocks, and to allow the entire system to be drained for maintenance. The successful construction of an inverted siphon, like the complex series of siphons at Lyon in France, or the one at Aspendos in modern-day Turkey, was perhaps the most technically demanding part of any aqueduct project. A clear demonstration of the engineers' confidence in their materials and their precise calculations. Finally, the entire blueprint for the aqueduct was not just a static plan, but a dynamic one that accounted for a lifetime of maintenance. The Romans, ever practical, knew that these were not build-and-forget structures. They were arteries that needed to be kept clean and clear. To facilitate this, access shafts, or puttae, were built at regular intervals along the underground sections. These allowed workers, the aquarii, to descend into the channel to clean out sediment, remove debris, and most importantly, chip away the ever-present mineral deposits or sinter that would otherwise gradually constrict and eventually choke the channel. The channels were generally built large enough for a person to walk or crawl through when the water flow was temporarily diverted. Furthermore, settling tanks, piscinae limariae, were strategically placed along the route. These were large open basins where the water would slow down, allowing sand, silt, and other impurities to settle to the bottom before the water continued on its journey. These tanks had to be periodically drained and cleaned out. The blueprint for an aqueduct was therefore a blueprint for a living system, one that required constant care and attention to function properly. The genius of this planning and surveying phase lay in its holistic nature. It was a synthesis of geology, geography, mathematics, material science, law, and public administration. The quiet work of the surveyor with his chorobates, the careful selection of a spring based on the health of a sheep's liver, the chemical magic of pozzolana-based concrete, the precise calculation of a gradient, and the daring design of an inverted siphon were all essential components of a successful project. These were the secrets hidden within the stone, the intellectual framework upon which the physical marvels were built. With the blueprint finalized, the surveys completed, the land rights secured, and the materials sourced, the monumental task of construction could finally begin. The quiet intellectual work of the planner, the surveyor, and the administrator was now complete. The lines on the wax tablets and papyrus maps, representing a fragile human intention imposed upon a wild landscape, were ready to be transformed into an enduring physical reality. This was the moment when the abstract genius of the design met the tangible skill of the builder, when the thunder of industry would replace the quiet contemplation of the surveyor. The construction of a Roman aqueduct was a vast and complex undertaking, a symphony of organized labor that unfolded across miles of varied terrain, a project so immense it could be compared to a sustained military campaign. It was a process that employed tens of thousands of individuals with a bewildering range of skills, from the raw muscle of the quarryman and the cart driver to the delicate precision of the carpenter, the timeless artistry of the mason, and the specialized knowledge of the hydraulic engineer. The organization behind such a project was as impressive, if not more so, than the final structure itself, a powerful testament to the Roman state's unparalleled ability to manage and execute public works on a scale previously unimaginable in human history. The entire operation was a human pyramid, a hierarchy of command and labor, as structured and disciplined as a Roman legion on the march. At the very apex of this pyramid was the state itself, embodied by the emperor, or, in the days of the Republic, the sponsoring magistrate like a censor or praetor. He was the ultimate patron, the one whose vision, ambition, and treasury made the project possible. Reporting to him was the chief architect, the architectus, a man of high social standing and profound technical knowledge. He was not a hands-on builder, but a project manager, a master designer who understood the interplay of physics, geology, and logistics. He would oversee the entire project, making the crucial decisions that would determine its success or failure. Beneath him was a cadre of professional specialists. These included the surveyors, the mensors and the levelers, the liberatores, who translated the architect's grand design into precise markers on the ground. These were the men who wielded the groma and the chorobates, whose calculations formed the invisible soul of the aqueduct. Their work was constant, as they would need to verify alignments and gradients at every stage of the construction process. Below this professional class were the foremen, the curatores or praefecti, who were the non-commissioned officers of the construction site. Each foreman was responsible for a specific section of the aqueduct's route, or a particular type of work. One might oversee a tunneling crew, another a team of masons building an arcade, and a third the operation of a quarry. They were the vital link between the high-level plans of the architect and the day-to-day work of the labourers. They had to be experienced, practical men, capable of reading plans, managing large crews, and solving the inevitable problems that arose on site. Under their command was the legion of skilled artisans. These were the master craftsmen, the fabbri, who possessed the specialized knowledge passed down through generations. There were the carpenters, the fabbri tignari, who were responsible for the enormous and complex task of building the scaffolding, the lifting cranes, and, most importantly, the precisely curved wooden centering for the arches. There were the masons, the lapidari, who could cut stone blocks with breathtaking precision, and the smiths, the fabbri ferrari, who forged the iron tools, the chisels, the hammers, and the clamps that held the structure together. These were free men, respected for their skills, who travelled from project to project across the empire, their expertise in high demand, the engine room of this entire enterprise. The great mass of disciplined and organized labor was very often the Roman army. The legions were not just a world-class fighting force, they were a mobile engineering corps, a national development agency in military uniform. During the long periods of peace, the famous Pax Romana, the state needed a way to keep its hundreds of thousands of soldiers busy, disciplined, and useful. Massive infrastructure projects were the perfect solution. Legionaries possessed the skills, the physical fitness, the discipline, and the internal organization to undertake enormous construction projects, from building roads and forts to digging canals and, of course, constructing aqueducts. The army was a self-contained unit, with its own surveyors, engineers, and skilled craftsmen. Deploying soldiers on these projects meant that a centrally commanded, highly reliable workforce was always available. It also ensured the security of the construction site, protecting the workers and supplies from raids by local tribes or bandits in untamed regions of the empire. Legions like the Legio III Augusta in North Africa, or the Legio Thent Gemini in Hispania, left behind inscriptions boasting of their work on aqueducts and other structures, a permanent record of their dual role as conquerors and builders. At the very bottom of this human pyramid, forming its broad and essential base, was the vast workforce of unskilled labor. This group was a mixture of people. Many were slaves, a ubiquitous and unfortunate feature of the Roman economy. They were considered property, instrumentum vocale, or talking tools, and were assigned the most grueling and dangerous tasks, digging the trenches under the hot sun, working in the darkness of the tunnels, or turning the massive treadmills of the lifting cranes. Prisoners of war, captured in Rome's endless campaigns, were often funneled directly into these state projects. In some cases, condemned criminals might also be sentenced to labor on the aqueducts. Alongside the slaves, there was also a significant amount of local civilian labor, the operae, who might be conscripted for the work or hired as temporary laborers, providing a vital source of income for the rural poor. The sheer number of hands involved is difficult to fathom. The construction of a major aqueduct like the Aqua Claudia, which took 14 years to complete under Caligula and Claudius, would have required a standing army of workers numbering in the tens of thousands, a moving city of labor stretched out for miles across the countryside. The construction process logically followed the path of the water, beginning at the source, the caput aquae. This was far more than simply sticking a pipe into a spring. An elaborate intake basin, or collecting gallery, was constructed to capture the water. This structure, often a small enclosed building of fine masonry, served several vital purposes. It protected the pure spring water from contamination by surface runoff, falling leaves, or animals. It often incorporated a small initial settling tank, a piscina limaria, to catch any immediate sediment before the water even began its journey. The engineering here was precise, designed to capture a steady, reliable flow without overwhelming the channel or depleting the spring itself. The Romans would often build a series of collection drains, fanning out from the main basin to gather water from a wider area. These headworks were the formal gateway, the point where the wild water of the mountain was tamed and entered the controlled, man-made environment of the Specus, the main water channel. From the source, the great journey to the city began. The vast majority of the aqueduct's length, typically around 80% of the total, was constructed as a simple covered channel, either set in a trench just below the ground or built at ground level and then buried under a protective mound of earth. The iconic soaring arches, while visually stunning, were the expensive and challenging exception rather than the rule, used only when topographical necessity absolutely dictated. The subterranean channel had a host of practical advantages. It was significantly cheaper and faster to build than a raised structure. It protected the water from the heat of the sun, which prevented evaporation and, just as importantly, kept the water cool and fresh, a quality highly prized by the Romans. Most importantly, as with the early aqueducts like the Aqua Appia, it kept the channel safe from both accidental damage and deliberate sabotage. An enemy army could march right over a buried aqueduct without even knowing it was there. The construction of these underground channels was a marvel of methodical, production line labor. The first step was the excavation of a trench along the surveyed line. The width and depth of the trench varied depending on the size of the aqueduct, but it was a colossal task of manual digging, undertaken by thousands of laborers with picks, shovels, and baskets. Once the trench was dug, a solid foundation of packed rubble and mortar, the statumen, was laid down to create a stable base. Upon this, the walls of the channel itself would be built. The Romans used several techniques for this. Sometimes they used carefully cut stone, but more often they relied on their preferred material, concrete. Wooden formwork or shuttering would be erected, and the mixture of lime, pozzolana, and aggregate would be poured in, course by course. As each section cured, the formwork would be dismantled and moved further down the line. This allowed for rapid, continuous construction. Once the walls and floor of the channel were complete and fully cured, the most critical phase of the channel construction began: the application of the waterproof lining. Without a perfect seal, the entire structure was useless. The Romans deployed their brilliant invention, opus signinum, a concrete blended with crushed terracotta tiles. This was not a single, simple application. It was a multi-layer process requiring skilled specialists. The workers would apply a rough first coat to the concrete shell. This was followed by several thinner, finer layers, with each layer being troweled and polished to a hard, smooth finish. The final surface was as smooth as glass, minimizing friction and preventing anything from clinging to the walls. The corners of the channel were often chamfered or curved, a clever detail designed to improve laminar flow and to prevent the buildup of debris and mineral deposits in sharp angles. After the lining was complete and had passed inspection, the channel was capped. This was usually done with thick stone slabs, or more commonly, by constructing a vaulted arch of concrete over the top. This roof was essential for keeping the water free from dirt, leaves, and any other contaminants. The entire structure was then buried, with the excavated earth being piled back over the top and compacted. The only trace left on the surface would be a series of regularly spaced stone markers, indicating the path of the channel, and more visibly, the stone-capped access shafts, the puta, that dotted the landscape every 30 to 60 meters. However, the Roman landscape was not a flat, featureless plain. The engineers frequently encountered obstacles that required more complex and daring solutions. The most common of these was a hill or a mountain that stood directly in the aqueduct's path. While the surveyors would always attempt to route the channel around such an obstacle, sometimes the most efficient path, the one that best preserved the precious gradient, was not around, but directly through. When a detour was too long and would add miles to the route, the Romans would not hesitate to tunnel directly through solid rock. This was grueling, dangerous, and time-consuming work, representing some of the most difficult engineering of the ancient world. Roman tunneling techniques were sophisticated, often employing a counter-excavation method similar to the Carnot system developed in ancient Persia. Instead of just starting at either end and hoping to meet in the middle, they would dig a series of vertical shafts from the top of the hill down to the proposed level of the tunnel. These shafts, the same pute used for maintenance access, allowed multiple teams of workers to attack the rock face simultaneously. They could dig towards each other from opposite ends of the main tunnel, and also dig in both directions from the bottom of each shaft. This multiplication of the workforce dramatically sped up the excavation. It also provided essential ventilation, allowing fresh air to reach the workers and smoke and dust to escape, and a much easier way to remove the excavated spoil, which could be lifted straight up the shafts in buckets, rather than being hauled for miles through a narrow tunnel. The alignment of these tunnels was a supreme test of the surveyor's skill. They would use their chorobates on the surface to plot the precise line of the tunnel. Then, using plumb lines dropped down the shafts, they would transfer that surface alignment to the darkness below ground. It was incredibly difficult to maintain a straight line in the cramped, dark conditions. Lighting was provided by smoky, inefficient oil lamps. The work was done by hand, with teams of miners using hammers, wedges, gads and chisels to slowly chip away at the rock. In harder rock like granite or basalt, they would employ the brutal but effective technique of fire quenching. A large fire would be built against the rock face, heating it to an extreme temperature. Then, water, or according to some sources, vinegar, whose acetic acid might have helped etch the rock, would be thrown onto the hot surface. The resulting thermal shock would cause the rock to crack and splinter, making it much easier for the miners to break it apart with their tools. It was dark, claustrophobic and perilous work. Tunnel collapses, flash floods, and respiratory diseases from the dust and smoke would have been constant dangers. This work was often carried out by the least valued members of the workforce: slaves, prisoners of war and condemned criminals, their lives spent in the suffocating darkness. Despite the challenges, the Romans achieved incredible feats of tunneling. The Claudius Tunnel, built to drain the Fucine Lake, was nearly 6 kilometers long. That these tunnels, dug from multiple directions, often met in the middle with only minor errors, is astonishing. However, errors did happen. An inscription from Salde in modern-day Algeria records the story of a non-commissioned officer and engineer who had to be called in to fix a tunnel where the two crews had missed each other completely, their tunnels bypassing each other in the darkness of the mountain. The inverse of the tunnel was the bridge. When the aqueduct's path encountered a dip in the landscape, a small stream, or a shallow valley, the solution was relatively simple: a solid raised wall or a small arched causeway to carry the channel across, while maintaining its elevation. But when faced with a wide river or a deep, plunging valley, the engineers had to take to the air. This was where the Romans deployed their most famous architectural and engineering signature, the magnificent multi-tiered arched bridge, the arcuations. These are the structures we picture when we think of a Roman aqueduct, and for good reason. They are magnificent feats of engineering and sublime works of art, symbols of a civilization at the peak of its confidence. The Pont du Gard in southern France is the quintessential example. It was part of the 50-kilometer aqueduct that supplied the city of Nimes. To cross the wide Gardon River, the Roman builders erected a structure of 3 tiers of arches, reaching a height of nearly 49 meters, or 160 feet. It is the tallest of all Roman aqueduct bridges, and a masterpiece of the form. The construction of such a bridge was a massive, multi-stage undertaking that began, as all great structures do, with the foundations. Solid foundations were absolutely critical. Any weakness in the footings would lead to the catastrophic failure of the entire structure. For the piers built on dry land, the workers would excavate a deep pit down to bedrock, creating a wide, stable base. For the piers that had to be built in the middle of a flowing river, a far more complex approach was needed. The Romans would construct a cofferdam, a temporary watertight enclosure. This was typically made by driving a double row of wooden piles or stakes into the riverbed in the shape of the pier. The space between the 2 rows of stakes would then be packed with puddle clay, a dense, impermeable material that would form a seal. Once the cofferdam was complete, the water inside could be pumped out, a laborious process using Archimedean screws or bucket chains powered by human treadmills. This allowed the workers to excavate the riverbed and build the pier's foundation on dry ground. The piers themselves were constructed of massive, precisely cut stone blocks or ashlars. These blocks, weighing several tons each, were often laid without any mortar, relying on their immense weight and the incredible precision of their cutting to hold them in place. The Romans often used iron clamps, set into dovetail grooves and sealed with molten lead, to tie the blocks together for added security. Many of these stones, as seen on the Pont du Gard, still have small protruding bosses left on their faces. These were used by the masons to help grip and lift the blocks with cranes, and were then left as a rustic, decorative feature, a practical scar that became an aesthetic choice. As the piers rose, a complex forest of wooden scaffolding, or machinae, would rise with them, enveloping the structure in a web of timber. The sheer amount of wood required for one of these projects was enormous, requiring the deforestation of entire hillsides. High atop the piers, the skilled carpenters would construct the most critical temporary element, the wooden centering. This was a massive semicircular wooden frame that would support the stones of the arch during construction. The centering had to be incredibly strong, engineered to bear the immense weight of the stone voussoirs, and it had to be precisely shaped to the exact curve of the arch as designed by the architect. Once the centering was in place, the masons would begin their work. They would lay the wedge-shaped stones of the arch, the voussoirs, over the wooden frame, working from both sides of the arch towards the center. Each stone had to be perfectly cut to fit. The final stone to be placed was the keystone, at the very apex of the arch. This was a moment of supreme importance. As the keystone was hammered into place, it translated the vertical force of gravity into powerful outward diagonal thrusts, which were channeled down through the voussoirs and into the solid piers. The arch was now a single, self-supporting structural unit, held together by the elegant physics of compression. After the keystone was set and the mortar between the voussoirs had fully cured, the moment of truth arrived, the striking or dismantling of the centering. This was a delicate and nerve-wracking process. The wooden frame would be carefully lowered, and for the first time the arch would bear its own weight. If the design was sound and the construction true, it would stand firm. If there were any flaws, it would be the moment of collapse. This modular, repeatable process of building pier, then centering, then arch, allowed the Romans to span vast distances with remarkable efficiency and rhythm. They would dismantle the centering from the completed arch and move it to the next set of piers, marching across the valley, arch by arch. Once the main arcade was complete, the builders would construct the water channel, the specus, on the top, a smaller version of the underground channel, with its same concrete shell and waterproof synonym lining, completing the aerial portion of the journey. The tools that built these incredible structures were simple but effective, many of which would be familiar to a builder today. They used iron shovels, picks, and crowbars for excavation. They had an array of specialized iron hammers and chisels for shaping stone. They had squares, levels, and plumb bobs for ensuring accuracy at every stage. For lifting the heavy stone blocks, they used powerful cranes and sheer legs. These were powered not by engines but by the muscles of men, typically slaves, walking inside a large human-sized hamster wheel called a treadmill. By walking, they could turn the winch that would slowly raise a multi-ton stone block into the air. The sheer amount of manual labor involved is almost impossible to comprehend in the modern age. Every stone was quarried, shaped, and lifted by hand. Every bucket of concrete was mixed on the ground with shovels and carried up the scaffolding by hand. Every mile of trench was dug by hand. The final phase of construction was the testing and commissioning of the aqueduct, a process known as probatio. After years of construction, the moment came to finally introduce the water. This was not done in a great rush. Water would be slowly let into the channel from the source. Teams of engineers and workers would walk the entire length of the structure, from the source to the city, meticulously checking for leaks. Any cracks or faults in the opus sinum lining that had appeared as the structure settled would be patched and repolished. The flow rate would be monitored to ensure the gradient was working as designed. Once the chief architect was satisfied that the system was watertight and functioning correctly, the full flow would be released. A dedicatory ceremony would be held, and a grand inscription would often be placed on the structure, especially at the Castellum Aquae where it entered the city. These inscriptions, like the one at the Porta Maggiore in Rome, are invaluable historical documents, proudly proclaiming the name of the emperor who commissioned the work, the name of the aqueduct, its source, and its length, forever associating the life-giving water with the generosity and power of the imperial family. The great torrent of pure, clean water would then begin its final, ceaseless descent into the city, where it would terminate at the Grand Distribution Center, a monument in its own right, marking the transition from the monumental art of construction to the complex science of urban distribution. The art of construction was therefore a story of human endeavor on the grandest scale. It was a story of overcoming immense natural obstacles through ingenuity, organization, and a sheer relentless force of will. It was the physical manifestation of the Roman character, practical, organized, and ruthlessly ambitious. The silent, steady flow of water through the completed channel was the quiet new pulse of the empire, a pulse set in motion by the hands of thousands of anonymous builders who turned an engineer's dream into an enduring reality. The journey from mountain to Metropolis was complete. The arrival of an aqueduct at the walls of Rome was not the end of its journey, but rather the dramatic climax of its first act. The immense volume of water, having travelled for dozens of miles across a painstakingly engineered landscape, a silent, ceaseless river flowing through tunnels of darkness and across sun-drenched arches, now stood at the threshold of the city. This was the moment of transition. The raw power of nature, harnessed and guided by human intellect, was about to be unleashed into the intricate circulatory system of the world's greatest metropolis. The final stage of the water's journey was a complex and masterfully orchestrated system of urban hydraulics, a network of arteries, veins, and capillaries that delivered the aqueduct's lifeblood into every conceivable corner of the city. The way the Romans managed, controlled, and apportioned this precious resource reveals as much about their society, their political priorities, and their administrative genius as the grand arches themselves. This was the system that transformed a raw element into the defining feature of Roman urban life, fueling everything from personal hygiene and public health to extravagant social rituals, industrial production, and the very aesthetic of the city. The grand gateway for this system, the formal point of entry where the aqueduct's long-distance run concluded, was the Castellum Aquae, or distribution tank. These were not simply enormous functional systems. They were sophisticated control points, and often magnificent architectural statements in their own right. Perched on one of the city's hills at the highest point the aqueduct could reach, the castellum was designed to celebrate the arrival of the water and to impress upon the populace the boundless generosity and power of the state, or more often the emperor who had commissioned it. The Castellum Divisorium at Nimes in France, the terminal point for the aqueduct that includes the Pont du Gard, provides a stunning example of this technology. It was a circular basin, over 5 meters in diameter, from which 10 large lead pipes radiated outwards, each feeding a different district of the city. The engineering inside these structures was elegant and practical. As the water poured into the main basin of the castellum, it would first pass through a final set of settling chambers. Here the water's velocity would slow dramatically, allowing any final fine sediment or debris that had been picked up along the journey to precipitate out, ensuring the water delivered to the city was as clear and pure as possible. From these settling basins, the water flowed into the main distribution tank, where the critical task of division took place. It was here that the Romans developed and implemented a brilliant and socially significant method for apportioning the water, a system that physically manifested the social priorities of the Roman state. The great Roman statesman and engineer Sextus Julius Frontinus, who served as curator aquarum, or water commissioner, under the Emperor Nerva in the late 1st century AD, wrote an exhaustive and invaluable report on the city's aqueducts, called De Aquis Urbis Romae. In it, he provides us with a detailed first-hand description of this remarkable system of triage. According to Frontinus, the outlet pipes from the main chamber of the castellum were typically arranged at 3 different, carefully calculated levels. This was a deliberate design, a hydraulic expression of public policy. The lowest pipes, those that would continue to receive water even if the overall supply dwindled, were designated for one purpose only: to supply the city's hundreds of public fountains, the salientes. This was the absolute highest priority. This arrangement ensured that, Even in times of drought or when an aqueduct was temporarily shut down for repairs, the public fountains would be the very last to run dry. It was a guarantee, written in lead and stone, that every citizen of Rome, from the most powerful senator to the most destitute pauper living in a crowded tenement, would have access to free, clean, life-sustaining water. This was a fundamental pillar of the social contract between the Roman state and its people, a critical element in maintaining public order and health. The middle tier of pipes, set at a higher level, directed water to the great public baths or thermae, and to other public buildings such as temples, markets, theatres, and the great amphitheatres, where it was used for cleaning, for cooling, and sometimes for staging spectacular aquatic displays. These institutions were central to Roman public life and culture, and while they were essential, they were deemed secondary to the basic, universal need for drinking water. Finally, the highest set of pipes, the first to run dry if the water level dropped, were reserved for the private, fee-paying customers. These were the concessiones, or grants of water, sold to the wealthy elite who could afford the considerable expense of having water piped directly into their private villas, domus, and their lavish gardens. This clever, three-tiered system was a physical manifestation of the Roman social hierarchy, a clear reflection of a society with vast disparities in wealth. Yet it was a hierarchy that was intelligently and pragmatically designed to prioritize the foundational needs of the general public over the luxuries of the privileged few. The state understood that while the rich could afford to buy their comforts, the provision of basic necessities to the masses was a non-negotiable responsibility of governance. From these primary castella, located at the edge of the city, the water was then channeled into a secondary, subterranean network of smaller pipes and conduits. This network fed a series of smaller distribution tanks, or castella privata, which were strategically located throughout the city's 14 districts. These acted as local substations, further dividing the flow to serve specific neighborhoods. From these local castella, the water destined for the public was piped to the thousands of public fountains. By the time of the late Empire, Rome boasted over 1,300 public fountains, an astonishing number that ensured no one was ever more than a short walk from a source of fresh water. These were not just functional spigots. Many were ornate structures, minor works of art decorated with intricate carvings and sculptures of gods, river deities, heroes, and mythological creatures. They were ubiquitous in the Roman urban landscape, found in public squares, fora, at busy crossroads, and tucked into the corners of residential neighborhoods, both rich and poor. They were vital social hubs, the ancient equivalent of the village well or the modern water cooler. Here people would gather to collect water in clay amphorae or wooden buckets, to wash clothes and produce, and to exchange news, information, and gossip. The constant sound of splashing water from these thousands of fountains would have been one of the defining elements of the city's auditory backdrop, a constant subliminal reminder of the wealth and life-giving abundance that the aqueducts provided. The most spectacular and profligate use of the aqueduct water was undoubtedly in the public baths, the thermae. These were not simply places to get clean. They were colossal, all-encompassing leisure palaces that were absolutely central to Roman social and cultural life. The great imperial baths, such as the Baths of Caracalla, completed in 2016 AD, or the even larger Baths of Diocletian, inaugurated in 306 AD, were vast, sprawling structures that could accommodate thousands of patrons at a single time. The Baths of Caracalla covered over 33 acres and could hold an estimated 1,600 bathers, while the Baths of Diocletian could hold up to 3,000. These magnificent complexes were supplied with a continuous, massive flow of water from dedicated branches of the aqueducts, such as the Aqua Marcia Antoniniana, built specifically for the Baths of Caracalla. The water was used to fill a carefully designed sequence of pools of varying temperatures, through which the bather would progress in a ritualized sequence. After disrobing in the changing room, the apoditerium, and perhaps engaging in some exercise in the open-air gymnasium, the palastra wrestling, weightlifting, or ball games, the bather would begin the cleansing process. This typically started with a visit to the warm room, the tepidarium, a humid, heated space designed to induce a gentle sweat. From there one would move to the hot room, the caldarium, which contained a pool of very hot water and was filled with steam. Here, the bather would sweat profusely, opening the pores. It was here that the actual cleaning took place, not with soap but with olive oil. The bather would rub oil over their body and then scrape it off, along with all the accumulated dirt and dead skin, using a curved metal scraper called a strigil. Finally, the process would conclude with an invigorating plunge into the cold pool in the frigidarium. This entire operation required an astonishing level of sophisticated background engineering. A complex network of furnaces, the prefurnium, often tended by hundreds of slaves, would burn tons of wood to heat water in massive bronze boilers. This heated water was then circulated through a system of lead pipes that ran under the floors and inside the walls, a system known as a hypercaust. This not only heated the water in the pools but also radiated heat through the marble floors and plastered walls, creating the warm and hot environments of the tepidarium and caldarium. The sheer volume of water required to keep these pools filled, clean, and at the correct temperature was immense. A constant flow that entered the complex, circulated through the various pools, and then drained away into the city's sewers. But the thermae were so much more than just bathing facilities. They were democratic institutions, open to all social classes, and often with a nominal or no entry fee. They were one of the few places in Roman society where a senator and a commoner could, in theory, rub shoulders. Beyond the baths themselves, these complexes contained libraries with scrolls in both Latin and Greek, lecture halls where poets and philosophers would give readings, art galleries filled with statues looted from Greece, beautifully manicured gardens for quiet contemplation, and stalls selling food and drink. One could spend an entire afternoon at the baths, exercising, socializing, conducting business, reading, relaxing, and networking. The very existence of these opulent, state-funded facilities open to the masses was made possible only by the seemingly infinite quantities of water supplied by the aqueducts. They represented the peak of Roman imperial luxury, a daily ritual that reinforced a shared Roman cultural identity and showcased the power and generosity of the emperor who had built or sponsored them. Beyond drinking and bathing, the water had another critical, though far less glamorous role in public health: sanitation. The vast quantities of runoff water from the thousands of fountains and the continuous drainage from the great baths were not wasted. This grey water was cleverly channeled into the city's extensive sewer system, including the ancient Cloaca Maxima. This constant flow acted as a powerful flushing mechanism, scouring the underground conduits and carrying the city's waste away from the crowded urban centre and depositing it downstream in the Tiber. This flushing action was particularly important for the public latrines, the foricae. Roman public latrines were often surprisingly elaborate, multi-seat affairs, with benches made of marble or stone that could accommodate dozens of people at once. Instead of private stalls, users would sit side by side, making it a surprisingly social experience. A continuous stream of water, diverted from a nearby fountain or bath, would run in a channel at the user's feet, acting as a constantly flowing sewer that immediately carried waste away. While the Roman understanding of germ theory was non-existent, they understood empirically that removing human waste was essential for creating a more pleasant and healthier city. The powerful synergy between the aqueduct system and the sewer system was a hallmark of their integrated approach to urban planning. The aqueducts brought clean water in, and the sewers, powered by that same water, took the dirty water and waste out. This system, while imperfect, dramatically reduced filth and stench in the city and undoubtedly helped to limit the spread of certain types of disease, contributing to the overall health of the massive population. The distribution system for private users was a lucrative source of state revenue, and for the administrator, a constant source of frustration and headaches. To receive a private connection, a wealthy Roman had to petition the state and obtain an official grant, a concessio, from the emperor or his designated water commissioner, the curator aquarum. This grant specified the exact amount of water the user was entitled to. The physical device that regulated this was a standardized bronze nozzle, or calyx, which was inserted into the public water main. The size of the opening in the calyx was strictly regulated, and each calyx was meant to be stamped with its official size and the name of the property owner. The property owner then paid a recurring tax or fee based on the size of this nozzle. This was the theory. The reality, as Frontatos complains about at great length in his report, was a system rife with fraud and corruption, An entire illicit industry of rogue plumbers, known as aquarii or water puncturers, existed. For a hefty bribe, these men would perform all manner of illegal modifications. They might install a calyx with a larger diameter than the one specified in the grant, allowing more water to flow through. They would attach pipes directly to the mains without any official calyx at all, creating a completely unmetered and illegal tap. They would even tap into the aqueduct channels themselves outside the city walls. Frontanus, in his role as water commissioner, approached his job with the stern integrity of an old-fashioned Roman. He meticulously measured the flow rates of the aqueducts as they entered the city, and compared them to the sum of the water allocated through official grants. He discovered massive discrepancies, finding that in some cases, more water was being illegally siphoned off than was being legally delivered. This was water that was being stolen from the state, and by extension from the public fountains and baths. Frontanus railed against these practices, which he saw as a theft from the Roman people. His detailed report is a fascinating account of his efforts to reform the system, to conduct a full survey of all connections, to license official plumbers, to destroy thousands of illegal taps, and to clamp down on the corrupt officials within his own department who colluded with the fraudsters. His struggles highlight the constant battle to maintain order and fairness in the distribution of this immensely valuable resource. For the wealthy few who had a legal or illegal private connection, the water was used to create a personal paradise. Their lavish villas, the domus, would often have their own private bath suites, mirroring the great public thermae in miniature. But the most ostentatious displays were in their gardens. The water was used to irrigate lush green oases in the dense, noisy urban landscape. Elaborate fountains, nymphaea, often set into decorated grottos, became the centerpiece of the courtyard garden or peristyle. The constant play of water was designed to create a sense of coolness, tranquility, and extreme luxury. The water was used for pure aesthetic effect, to delight the senses, and to display the owner's immense wealth and sophistication to his guests. In some of the most extravagant villas, like that of the Emperor Hadrian at Tivoli, water was used to create entire landscapes with vast pools, canals, and elaborate water features designed to evoke the distant lands of the empire. Roman engineers even dabbled in hydraulic automata, using the flow of water and trapped air to create moving statues, singing birds, or other marvels designed to astonish and entertain. The water also had a range of crucial commercial and industrial applications that formed the economic backbone of the city. One of the most important of these was milling. The constant, reliable flow of water from the aqueducts could be used to power water wheels, which were connected to mills mole, for grinding the vast quantities of grain needed to produce the flour for the city's daily bread ration. While most of Rome's grain was likely ground by animal or human-powered mills, archaeological evidence for large-scale water mills exists. The most stunning example is not in Rome itself, but at Barbegal in southern Gaul, modern France. Here, a branch of the local aqueduct was channeled to power a massive milling complex, a veritable grain factory from the ancient world. The water flowed down a steep hill through a series of 16 water wheels, arranged in 2 parallel cascades of 8, with each wheel driving a pair of millstones. It is estimated that this industrial complex could grind enough flour to feed the entire population of the nearby city of Arelate, Arles. In Rome, the Janiculum Hill was known for its water mills, powered by the Aqua Traiana. This use of water power represents an early and significant form of industrial automation, a hint of the technologies that would transform the world many centuries later. Water was also essential for numerous crafts and industries within the city. The fullers who ran the laundries of ancient Rome were major consumers. A Roman fullonica was a workshop where newly woven woolen cloth was treated, and where dirty garments were laundered. The process involved stomping on the cloth in large vats filled with a mixture of water and, famously, aged human urine. The ammonia in the urine acted as a powerful degreasing agent and bleach. After this unpleasant scouring process, the cloth would be rinsed repeatedly in large basins of clean water supplied by the aqueducts to remove all traces of the detergent. Tanneries, another essential but foul-smelling industry, also required vast quantities of water for soaking, cleaning, and processing animal hides. In some parts of the empire, the Romans harnessed aqueduct technology for a far more dramatic and destructive industrial purpose: hydraulic mining, or ruina montium, the ruining of mountains. In gold-rich regions like Las Medulas in northwestern Spain, engineers would build multiple aqueducts to capture mountain streams and rivers, channeling the water into massive reservoirs poised high above the gold-bearing hills. When a sufficient head of water had been accumulated, sluice gates would be opened, and a colossal torrent of water would be unleashed. The resulting wave would slam into the hillside with unimaginable force, washing away entire mountains of softer earth and rock to expose the gold-bearing deposits beneath. It was a terrifyingly effective form of strip mining, a testament to the Romans' ability to wield hydraulic engineering as both a creative and a destructive tool. The entire sprawling distribution system, from the grand castellum aquo to the last lead pipe in a private home, was managed by a dedicated and sophisticated state bureaucracy. Under the Republic, this was the responsibility of various magistrates, but under the Empire it was centralized under the authority of the curator aquarum, a prestigious and powerful post typically held by a high-ranking senator of consular rank, appointed directly by the emperor. Sextus Julius Frontinus, whose report is our single best source of information on this topic, held this post with immense pride and a deep sense of civic duty. The curator had a large permanent staff of imperial slaves and freedmen, a veritable water department with a clear organizational structure. This team included the surveyors and engineers who planned repairs and extensions. There were the overseers, the villaci, who managed the day-to-day operations of the pipes and conduits. There were the keepers of the distribution tanks, the castellariae, who were responsible for monitoring and controlling the flow at the local level. There were the line walkers or inspectors, the surveyors, who patrolled the aqueduct lines both inside and outside the city, looking for leaks, damage, or illegal taps. And then there were the gangs of maintenance workers, the aquariae, who were responsible for the ongoing physical labor of cleaning the channels and repairing breaks. It was a complex and demanding administrative task, requiring detailed records of grants, regular inspections, a deep practical knowledge of the city's hydraulic infrastructure, and a constant war against corruption. Life in Rome was thus defined and enabled by the presence of water in a way that was utterly unique in the ancient world. For the average Roman, it meant the simple, revolutionary luxury of easy access to clean drinking water, dramatically reducing the risk of the waterborne diseases that constantly plagued most other pre-modern cities. It meant the ability to partake in the quintessentially Roman ritual of the baths, a cornerstone of social, recreational, and business life. It meant cleaner streets, cleaner public spaces, and a level of public sanitation that would not be seen again in Europe for over 1,000 years. For the city as a whole, it meant the ability to support a population of close to 1 million people, an urban density that would have been physically impossible without such a sophisticated and abundant water supply. The aqueducts were, in essence, the enabling technology of Roman imperial urbanism. They allowed the city to become the sprawling, magnificent, and complex entity that it was, the true capital of the world. The system was not perfect. Illegal siphoning was a constant problem, and the widespread reliance on lead pipes likely had subtle, long-term health consequences for the population. But the overall impact was overwhelmingly transformatively positive. The constant, reliable, and abundant flow of water was the city's very lifeblood, a resource that was managed with a remarkable blend of engineering brilliance, administrative rigor, and a clear-eyed understanding of social priorities. The journey from the distant mountain spring had finally ended, splintering into 1 million different streams and purposes, in a cup of cool water for a thirsty plebeian at a street corner fountain, in the steaming marble-lined pool of an imperial bath, in the ornate glittering fountain of a senator's private garden, and in the dark rushing channel of a public latrine. Each individual drop was a small liquid testament to the grand unified system that had brought it there. For centuries, the aqueducts were the very pulse of Rome, their steady, silent flow as fundamental to the city's existence as the beating of a heart. Their ceaseless delivery of clean, cool water was a potent and ever-present symbol of the empire's power, its wealth, and its perceived permanence. The water was a daily miracle, a gift from the mountains delivered by the gods of engineering, a testament to a civilization that had not only conquered peoples but had mastered nature itself. But no empire, no matter how mighty, is eternal. No structure, no matter how well built, can outlast the civilization that maintains it. As the Western Roman Empire entered a long, agonizing period of decline throughout the 4th and 5th centuries AD, so too did its most magnificent and vital infrastructure. The story of the aqueduct's decline is inextricably linked to the story of the empire's fall. It was not a single sudden event, but a slow, creeping decay, a gradual silencing of the waters that had once given the city its vibrant, teeming life. It was a long, drawn-out process of systemic failure, where the complex organism that was the Roman state could no longer sustain the arteries that had nourished it for so long. The complex system that required immense organizational effort, vast financial resources, and a centralized, unchallenged authority to build and maintain, could not possibly survive the political fragmentation, the devastating economic collapse, and the chronic endemic warfare that characterized the violent and chaotic end of the ancient world. The decline began subtly, not with the dramatic crash of a falling arch, but with the quiet scratching of a pen in a bookkeeper's ledger. The Roman Empire in its final centuries was an empire in perpetual crisis. Its economy, once fueled by conquest and expansion, faltered and then began to contract. The tax base shrank as provinces were lost or became ungovernable, and agricultural output declined. The state's vast revenues, which had once seemed limitless, were now stretched to their breaking point. The immense sums of money required for the regular, painstaking and unending maintenance of the aqueducts became harder and harder to find. The military, struggling to defend 1,000 miles of frontier against constant barbarian incursions, consumed an ever larger share of the imperial budget. Faced with a choice between paying a legion to fight the Goths on the Danube or funding a crew of masons to patch a leak in the Aqua Claudia, the choice for a beleaguered emperor was grimly obvious. The state bureaucracy, once a model of ruthless efficiency, began to break down. The office of the Curator Aquarum, once a prestigious post for a senior senator, likely became a hollow title, its authority diminished and its budget slashed. The specialized teams of skilled aquarii who patrolled the lines, cleared the channels of sediment, and patched the waterproof lining became smaller, less skilled, and less effective. Their salaries went unpaid, and the institutional knowledge they possessed, passed down through generations, began to fade away. This slow starvation of resources manifested as a physical decay, a kind of creeping sclerosis of the system. Small faults, which in the Golden Age would have been identified and repaired within weeks, now went unrepaired for years or forever. The ever-present mineral incrustations, the hard layers of calcium carbonate or sinter, that slowly but surely built up on the walls of the specus, were not chipped away as regularly. Year by year, decade by decade, these deposits grew thicker, gradually reducing the channel's capacity, like a hardening of the arteries, constricting the flow of life-giving water. A small leak from a cracked slab of opus cyanenum would be left to trickle, the water seeping into the concrete core and masonry of the structure. Over the seasons, through the cycles of freezing and thawing, this moisture would expand and contract, weakening the structure from within. Outside the city, the legally mandated buffer zones on either side of the aqueducts were no longer policed. Farmers would plough too close to the foundations, and trees would be allowed to grow. Their powerful roots, inexorably seeking water, would work their way into the masonry, their slow, patient pressure capable of cracking the strongest Roman concrete. Minor earthquakes, a common occurrence in the Italian peninsula, might cause small shifts in the foundations or cracks in the arches. In previous eras, these would have been immediately assessed and repaired. Now the damage was cumulative. The aqueducts were like a living organism, a magnificent but aging creature that was slowly succumbing to 1,000 small illnesses of neglect. For the average citizen in Rome, the change would have been almost imperceptible at first. Perhaps a fountain's flow seemed a little weaker. Perhaps the water in the baths was not as fresh as it used to be. But the system as a whole was failing. This long, slow decline was dramatically and brutally accelerated by the wars that ravaged the Italian peninsula in the turbulent centuries after the formal fall of the last Western emperor in 476 AD. The final decisive blows were struck during the Gothic War of the 6th century, a brutal 2-decade-long conflict between the Ostrogothic kingdom that controlled Italy and the armies of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire under the ambitious Emperor Justinian, who sought to reconquer the lost western provinces and restore the glory of Rome. In the year 537 AD, the Gothic king Witiges, finding himself unable to take the heavily fortified city of Rome by storm, laid siege to it. Believing he could force the city into submission by thirst, he made a fateful and devastating strategic decision. He ordered his men to find and sever all 11 of the great aqueducts that supplied the city. His soldiers, armed with sledgehammers and crowbars, swarmed over the Roman Campagna. They smashed the elegant arcades of the Aqua Claudia and the Aqua Marcia, toppling the arches and leaving great gaping wounds in the lines. They found the underground channels of the other aqueducts and blocked them with earth and stone. The flow of water that had sustained the city for over 800 years, the flow that had defined its very existence, was stopped. The great fountains in the city's fora would have sputtered, gurgled, and then, for the first time in centuries, fallen silent. The water level in the great pools of the baths of Caracalla and Diocletian would have begun to drop, never to be refilled. The Byzantine general, the brilliant Belisarius, who was defending the city, immediately recognized the catastrophic nature of this act. He also recognized a secondary threat. The Goths could potentially use the now dry, man-sized channels of the aqueducts as secret passages to infiltrate the city. He immediately ordered his soldiers to seal the openings of the aqueducts where they passed through the Aurelian walls, blocking them with stone and mortar. This act of defensive necessity was also an act of finality. The great system was now broken at both ends. This was a catastrophic turning point in the history of Rome. Although the Byzantines eventually won the war and retook the city, and even made some sporadic attempts at repairs, the old magnificent system was never fully restored to its former glory. The damage was simply too extensive, and the resources, political will, and crucially, the centralized authority and engineering knowledge of the old empire were gone forever. The cutting of the aqueducts had a devastating and immediate impact on the life of the city. The great imperial baths, which required a colossal and continuous flow of water, were forced to close permanently. They were abandoned, their vast halls left to the ghosts of the past. The thousands of fountains ran dry. The sewer system, deprived of its flushing water, ceased to function effectively, and the city's sanitation collapsed. The demographic and psychological consequences were profound. The population of Rome, which had been close to 1 million people at its peak, plummeted into a free fall. Deprived of their clean, reliable water source high on the city's hills, the remaining inhabitants were forced to make a great migration within the city itself. The Quirinal, the Viminal, the Esquiline. These healthy, airy hills, once home to the villas of the rich and the great baths, were now without water. They were gradually abandoned, becoming a depopulated wasteland of crumbling ruins and vineyards known as the Disabitato. The shrunken population, now perhaps numbering only 30 or 40,000, clustered in the low-lying areas of the Campus Martius close to the Tiber. They were forced to revert to the old ways, the ways of their distant ancestors before the Aqua Appia. They drew their water once again directly from the river, which was now more polluted than ever, a receptacle for the city's unflushed waste. They dug wells into the marshy ground, drawing up brackish, unhealthy water. The medieval city of Rome was a pale, sickly shadow of its former self, a small, impoverished town living amidst the colossal, incomprehensible ruins of a forgotten golden age. The silence of the water was the silence of a civilization in retreat. Throughout the long centuries of the Middle Ages, the great aqueducts stood as silent, broken giants in the Roman countryside. Their purpose was largely forgotten by the general populace, who viewed them with a mixture of awe and fear. They were seen as the work of demons or giants, opera dei giganti. Their towering, skeletal arches became the subject of folklore and dark legends. More practically, they became a convenient source of building materials for the impoverished city. They were treated as vast, pre-cut stone quarries. For centuries, the people of Rome systematically plundered the aqueducts. Their finely cut stone blocks were pried loose and carted away to build the crude defensive towers of warring noble families, the walls of new monasteries, and the foundations of medieval churches. Their lead pipes were dug up and melted down. Their marble facings were stripped and burned in kilns to produce lime for mortar. It was an act of cannibalism, a city literally consuming its own glorious past in order to survive the present. The channels became overgrown with weeds and ivy, their concrete roofs collapsing, their once smooth linings buried under centuries of accumulated dirt. However, even in this long, dark period, the memory of the water was not entirely extinguished. A few precious drops of the old system managed to survive. The Aqua Virgo, because its route was almost entirely subterranean and thus less vulnerable to destruction and plunder, continued to trickle a small amount of water into the city, feeding a few fountains in the Campus Martius where the population was clustered. Its survival was a thin thread connecting medieval Rome back to the age of Augustus. There were also brief flashes of the old Roman spirit of public works, driven by the needs of the papacy. In the late 8th century, Pope Adrian I, recognizing the need for clean water for the burgeoning religious center around St. Peter's Basilica, managed to gather the resources and the rudimentary engineering knowledge to repair the ancient Aqua Traiana. This restored aqueduct, later renamed the Aqua Parla, brought water once again to the Vatican Hill, a small but vital revival of the ancient tradition. And within the libraries of remote monasteries, places of quiet scholarship like Monte Cassino, the knowledge of the ancient world was being painstakingly preserved. Monks who may have had little understanding of the engineering principles involved copied and recopied the works of ancient authors like Vitruvius and, most importantly, Sextus Julius Frontinus. His detailed treatise De Aquis Urbis Romae survived the collapse of civilization, sleeping on a dusty shelf, a time capsule waiting for a future generation that could once again comprehend its genius. That future generation arrived with the Renaissance. In the 15th century, a profound shift in consciousness swept through Italy. A renewed, fervent interest in all things classical, in the art, the literature, the philosophy, and the science of ancient Greece and Rome took hold of the intellectual elite. This was humanism, a movement that sought to learn from, and if possible, surpass the achievements of the ancients. Scholars and artists began to study the ancient ruins not as the works of demons or as convenient quarries, but with new analytical eyes, seeing them as models of perfection and as sources of knowledge. The great aqueducts, the most visible and dramatic ruins in the Roman landscape, became objects of intense study, a pivotal moment, an event that acted as a key turning a long-locked door, occurred in the year 1425. The brilliant and obsessive papal secretary and book hunter, Poggio Bracciolini, discovered a manuscript copy of Frontinus's De Aquis in the library of the monastery at Monte Cassino. Its rediscovery sent a shockwave through the intellectual circles of the Renaissance. Here, in the clear, precise Latin of a Roman official, was a detailed first-hand account of how the entire water system worked. Its scale, its sources, its administration, the laws that governed it, and the engineering challenges that were overcome. It was like finding the original annotated blueprint for a lost and superior technology. Humanist scholars, architects and engineers, men like the great Leon Battista Alberti, pored over this text, marveling at the sophistication and the sheer scale of their Roman predecessors' achievements. Leonardo da Vinci, the ultimate Renaissance man, filled his notebooks with sketches of hydraulic systems and engineering devices, clearly influenced by Roman principles. The popes of the Renaissance, who were often secular princes as much as spiritual leaders, saw themselves as the new Caesars. They embarked on ambitious programs of urban renewal, determined to restore the city of Rome to its former glory and to solidify their own power and prestige. A central part of this vision was the revival of the aqueducts. They understood, just as the emperors had, that providing water was a powerful political statement. They began the process of restoring the ancient conduits. Pope Nicholas V in the mid-15th century commissioned Alberti to repair the Aqua Virgo, increasing its flow and extending it into the heart of the city, where it would eventually power the Trevi Fountain. But the most significant of these papal projects came in the late 16th century, under the dynamic and iron-willed Pope Sixtus V. In a whirlwind 5-year reign, he transformed the face of Rome with a massive public works campaign. His crowning achievement was the construction of a new aqueduct, the Aqua Felice, completed in 1587. It was a conscious and explicit revival of the ancient tradition, closely following the route of the ancient Aqua Alexandrina. The Aqua Felice brought water back to the high hills of Rome, the Quirinal and Esquiline, for the first time in 1,000 years, making it possible to repopulate these abandoned areas. The project culminated in the construction of a massive terminal fountain, the Fountain of Moses, a triumphant, if artistically questionable, monument that celebrated the Pope's achievement, explicitly comparing him to the biblical prophet who brought forth water from the rock. The age of the aqueducts had returned. The enduring legacy of the Roman aqueducts, however, extends far beyond the beautiful fountains of papal Rome. The principles of Roman engineering, rediscovered, studied, and disseminated during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, became foundational to the development of modern civil engineering. The understanding of the gravity-fed system, the structural genius of the arch for spanning long distances, and the critical importance of public infrastructure for the health and prosperity of a city are all lessons learned directly from the Romans. When great cities like London and Paris began to grow explosively during the Industrial Revolution, they faced sanitation and public health crises that were terrifyingly similar to that of ancient Rome: overcrowding, polluted rivers, and rampant disease. Their 19th-century engineers and reformers, men like Joseph Bazalgette in London and Eugène Belgrand in Paris, looked back to Roman precedents as they designed the new water supply and sewer systems that would make modern urban life possible. The great aqueducts of the Roman Empire, from the soaring Pont du Gard in France to the perfectly preserved Aqueduct of Segovia in Spain, and the elegant two-tiered Velens Aqueduct in Istanbul, stood as powerful physical proof of what could be achieved. They were a source of inspiration and a practical textbook written in stone. Today, the legacy of the aqueducts resonates in several distinct but interconnected ways. First, and most obviously, there is the archaeological and historical legacy. The ruins that survive are among the most powerful and evocative symbols of the Roman Empire. They are a tangible, physical link to the past, allowing us to stand in the presence of Roman genius and to marvel at the scale and ambition of their civilization. They are an immense source of historical information, telling us about Roman technology, their economy, their social structure, and the details of their daily lives. They are also, quite simply, beautiful objects. Their elegant, rhythmic forms harmonize with the natural landscape in a way that continues to inspire artists, painters like Giovanni Battista Piranesi, whose dramatic etchings of the ruins captivated the European imagination, as well as modern architects, photographers, and poets. They are a protected part of our shared world heritage, a treasure to be preserved. Second, there is the profound engineering legacy. The Roman aqueduct is the direct, linear ancestor of our modern water supply systems. While we now use powerful electric pumps, pressurized iron and steel pipes, and sophisticated digital control and water treatment plants, the fundamental concept, the bulk transport of fresh water from a distant, clean source to a dense population center, is a Roman one. The emphasis on a constant, reliable gradient for the management of pressure, the challenges of tunneling and bridging, and the need for a comprehensive hierarchical distribution network are all principles that a Roman engineer like Frontinus would have immediately understood and respected. The aqueducts serve as a timeless reminder that advanced technology is not just about new, revolutionary inventions, but about the intelligent, large-scale, and persistent application of fundamental physical principles. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, there is the civic legacy, the political and philosophical idea that the aqueducts represent. The Roman aqueduct system is one of history's greatest and most enduring monuments to the concept of public works. The Roman state, at its best, invested a colossal amount of its wealth, its intellectual capital, and its manpower into a system that benefited every single inhabitant of the city. The deliberate, systemic decision to prioritize the public fountains, which served the poor, over the private connections that served the rich, demonstrates a concept of the public good, of cura publica, that was revolutionary for its time and remains deeply relevant today. The aqueducts are a powerful physical argument for the importance of long-term investment in public infrastructure as the foundational bedrock of a healthy, prosperous, and stable society. In an age so often defined by short-term thinking, they stand as a 2,000-year-old rebuke to expediency. a testament to the idea that great civilizations are built not just on military victories and political conquests, but on the provision of essential services that improve the quality of life for all their citizens. So when we look today at the weathered, sun-bleached archers of the Aqua Claudia marching across the green fields of the Roman Campagna, or when we stand beneath the perfectly preserved, golden-hued tiers of the Pont du Gard as the river flows silently below, we are seeing more than just an ancient ruin. We are seeing the physical embodiment of a powerful idea. It is the idea that a city's greatness can be measured, not just by its temples and palaces, but by the purity of its water. It is the idea that engineering can be an art form, shaping the landscape with both function and sublime beauty. It is the idea that the collective good, the health and well-being of the entire community, can and should be a paramount priority of the state. These echoes in stone are the final, deepest secret of the Roman aqueducts. They were not merely channels for water, they were channels for the very idea of civilization itself. Their flow may have been silenced by the violence and neglect of a darker age, but their legacy continues to run deep and clear, a timeless source of inspiration and a powerful, humbling reminder of the enduring genius of their builders. They are a quiet, magnificent monument to a simple but profound truth, that sometimes the most powerful force in shaping history is nothing more than a simple, steady stream of clean water. Our story thus far has remained tethered to the city of Rome, the great insatiable heart of the empire, and the 11 legendary aqueducts that served as its arteries. We have traced their genesis from a desperate need, marveled at their design, walked through the Herculean effort of their construction, followed their life-giving water through the city's veins, and mourned their eventual decline and celebrated their rediscovery. But to confine the story of the Roman aqueduct to the city of Rome alone is to miss the true scale and significance of this revolutionary technology. The aqueduct was not merely a solution to a local problem, it was a core component of the Roman imperial toolkit, a standardized yet infinitely adaptable system that was exported to every corner of the empire. It was a fundamental instrument of Romanization, a technology that physically imprinted Roman order onto conquered landscapes. Wherever the legions went, wherever new colonies were founded, wherever a city was to be raised to the status of a provincial capital, the construction of an aqueduct was as essential as the building of a forum, a basilica, or a temple. It was the aqueduct that made the Roman way of life possible, allowing for the construction of the grand public baths, the ornamental fountains, and the sanitary systems that were the hallmarks of Roman urbanism. To build an aqueduct in a newly conquered province was a profound statement. It declared that this was no longer merely a subjugated territory, but a place that was being integrated into the fabric of civilization, a place where one could live like a Roman. The engineers who fanned out across the empire faced a dizzying array of new challenges that tested their skills and forced them to innovate in ways their colleagues in the capital never had to. The familiar landscape of the Roman Campagna and the Sabine Hills gave way to the rugged limestone plateaus of Gaul, the sun-baked plains of Hispania, the arid deserts of North Africa, and the mountainous, seismically active terrain of Asia Minor. Each province presented unique problems of geology, climate, water scarcity, and available building materials. The Roman engineers, with their characteristic pragmatism and adaptability, rose to these challenges. They did not simply replicate the designs of the Aqua Claudia or the Aqua Marcia. Instead, they tailored their designs to local conditions, creating a remarkable diversity of structures that stand today as testaments to their creative problem-solving. They spanned wider valleys, built longer channels, and developed more sophisticated solutions for dealing with immense water pressure than ever before. The story of the provincial aqueducts is the story of Roman engineering on the frontier, a narrative of how a core technology was pushed to its absolute limits. In exploring these provincial marvels, we see not just the spread of an idea, but its evolution, its diversification, and its ultimate expression as a universal symbol of an empire built not just on military might, but on the transformative power of water. This is the story of the creation of an empire of water. Unlike the arcades of Rome, which were built of brick-faced concrete, the Pont du Gard is constructed entirely from massive blocks of locally quarried, golden-hued shelly limestone. An estimated 50,400 tons of stone were used, with some individual blocks weighing up to 6 tons. It consists of 3 tiers of arches, reaching a total height of 48.8 meters, making it the tallest of all Roman aqueduct bridges. The lower tier features 6 wide arches, designed to allow the river to pass through. The second tier is composed of 11 arches, rhythmically spanning the valley. The top tier, which carries the water channel itself, is a row of 47 smaller arches, originally, though some have been lost. The entire structure is a masterpiece of precise mortarless construction, a technique known as opus quadratum. The stones were so perfectly cut that they relied primarily on friction and their immense weight to hold them in place, although iron clamps were also used. The projecting bosses visible on the faces of the blocks are not merely decorative, they are the practical remnants of the construction process, left by the masons to help them lift and position the stones with their cranes. The genius of the 3-tiered design is both structural and aesthetic. It creates a powerful, stable structure that is also light and elegant, its open arches minimizing the resistance to wind and floodwaters. Standing beneath it today, one is struck not only by its immense size, but by its harmony with the surrounding landscape, a sublime fusion of nature and human artistry. But the story of Roman engineering in Gaul is not limited to the brute elegance of the Pont du Gard. Further north in the city of Lyon, the ancient Lugdunum, engineers faced a challenge of a completely different nature. Lugdunum was the capital of Roman Gaul, a vital administrative and commercial hub perched on a commanding position at the confluence of the Rhône and Saône rivers. To supply this major city, which sat on the high ground of the Fourvière Hill, the Romans built not 1 but 4 separate aqueducts. The engineering challenges here were arguably greater than anywhere else in the empire. The terrain around Lyon is characterized by a series of deep, steep-sided river valleys. Building bridges on the scale of the Pont du Gard across these valleys would have been impractical, if not impossible. Instead, the Roman engineers were forced to rely on and perfect the most complex and daring technology in their arsenal, the inverted siphon. The aqueduct of Gers, the most impressive of the 4 that served Lyon, is a showcase of this technology. Over its 86-kilometer length, it had to cross 10 valleys. For the smaller ones, traditional bridges were used, but for the 4 major river valleys, the Garonne, the Iseron, and 2 smaller tributary valleys, the engineers had to construct massive inverted siphons. The siphon that crossed the Iseron Valley was an engineering marvel. The water arrived in the main channel at a header tank on the edge of the valley. From there it was funneled into a battery of 9 parallel lead pipes, each about 20 centimeters in diameter. These pipes descended the steep slope of the valley, supported by a substructure, before crossing the river on a low bridge or venter. This bridge was essential to support the immense weight of the water-filled pipes and to withstand the pulsating forces of the flow. The pipes then ascended the opposite slope to a receiving tank, located at an elevation just slightly lower than the header tank, before the water continued on its journey in a standard gravity-fed channel. The hydrostatic pressures at the bottom of this siphon, over 60 meters below the header tank, would have been immense, exceeding 10 atmospheres. This placed enormous stress on the lead pipes and especially on their soldered joints. The construction of these siphons was a high-stakes gamble, a testament to the engineers' confidence in their materials and their deep practical understanding of hydraulics. The 4 aqueducts of Lyon, with their complex systems of bridges, tunnels, and multiple high-pressure siphons, represent a pinnacle of Roman engineering sophistication, a solution tailored not to a wide, gentle landscape like the Campagna, but to a rugged, challenging terrain that demanded a different kind of genius. From Gaul we journey south, across the Pyrenees, into Hispania, modern-day Spain. Here, on a vast and often arid peninsula that was a key source of the empire's mineral wealth, the aqueducts often served a different purpose. They were not just about providing urban amenities, they were instruments of control and statements of raw power, particularly in a province that had been conquered only after centuries of brutal warfare. The most dramatic and iconic of all Spanish aqueducts is the one that still dominates the city of Segovia. Built around the turn of the 2nd century AD, likely under the Emperor Trajan, the Aqueduct of Segovia is a breathtaking spectacle. Its most famous feature is the immense 2-tiered arcade, known locally as El Puente, the bridge, that strides for over 800 meters through the heart of the modern city. Reaching a maximum height of 28.5 meters, It is constructed from over 24,000 massive, rough-hewn granite blocks, perfectly fitted together without a single drop of mortar. The raw, almost brutalist power of its dark granite structure stands in stark contrast to the golden elegance of the Pont du Gard. This was not meant to be subtle. It was a clear and overwhelming statement of Roman presence and permanence, a structure designed to awe and intimidate the local population, supplying water to the city and its military garrison. Its remarkable state of preservation, standing tall in the center of a bustling city, makes it one of the most powerful surviving testaments to Roman engineering anywhere in the world. Further south, in what is now Extremadura, lies the city of Merida, the ancient Emerita Augusta. Founded in 25 BC as a settlement for veteran soldiers emeriti from the Cantabrian Wars, it grew to become the capital of the province of Lusitania and one of the most important cities in Roman Spain. To supply this grand city, the Romans built a complex water system, including two major aqueducts that drew water from reservoirs created by massive dams, the Proserpina and Cornalvo dams, which are among the oldest and best preserved Roman dams in existence. The most visually striking of the aqueducts that fed Merida is the one known today as the Aqueducto de los Milagros, the Aqueduct of the Miracles. The name speaks to the awe it has inspired for centuries. What makes it so remarkable is its beautiful and distinctive construction technique. The soaring piers are built using alternating courses of dressed granite blocks, opus quadratum, and layers of red brick, opus testaceum. This composite method, known as opus mixtum, creates a striking visual effect, a series of bold red and grey stripes that make the structure instantly recognizable. The use of brick for the arches themselves provided great tensile strength and allowed for faster construction. The Aqueduct of the Miracles is a prime example of Roman engineers adapting their techniques to the available local materials, in this case excellent granite and high-quality clay for brickmaking, to create a structure that was both incredibly durable and aesthetically unique. It demonstrates a stylistic flair that goes beyond pure utilitarian function. The story of Roman hydraulics in Spain has an even more dramatic chapter. In the northwestern region of Leon, at Las Médulas, the Romans undertook the largest open-pit gold mining operation in the entire empire. Here, the principles of the aqueduct were turned to a purely industrial and terrifyingly destructive purpose. Engineers constructed a complex network of at least 7 aqueducts, stretching for hundreds of kilometers, to capture the water of mountain streams. This water was not intended for drinking or bathing. It was channeled into large reservoirs poised high above the gold-bearing mountains. When a massive volume of water had been collected, sluice gates would be thrown open, unleashing a cataclysmic flood in a technique known as ruina montium, the ruining of the mountains. The force of the water would tear away the topsoil and softer rock of entire hillsides, exposing the gold deposits beneath. The Romans would then use smaller streams of water to wash the gold-bearing clays through a series of filtering channels. It was hydraulic engineering as a weapon against the earth itself, an environmental catastrophe on a staggering scale that left behind the surreal, jagged, red rock landscape that can be seen at Las Médulas today. It is a chilling reminder of the ruthless efficiency that lay at the heart of the Roman imperial machine, crossing the Mediterranean to the sun-scorched landscapes of North Africa. We find stories of engineering on an even grander scale, designed to overcome the immense challenge of water scarcity. After its final destruction in the Punic Wars, Rome's ancient rival Carthage was reborn as a magnificent Roman city, the capital of the wealthy province of Africa Proconsularis. To supply this new metropolis, Roman engineers constructed one of the longest aqueducts in the entire empire. The Zaguan Aqueduct stretched for an astonishing 132 kilometers, 82 miles from its source in the hills of Jebel Zaguan to the city of Carthage on the coast. The sheer length of this aqueduct posed immense challenges. Much of its route crossed vast, flat plains, which meant that to maintain the necessary gentle gradient, the channel had to be carried on raised arcades for mile after mile. The surviving arches, particularly the magnificent section at Udna, are a testament to this immense undertaking. Building an aqueduct of this length in an arid climate, where every drop of water lost to evaporation or leaks was a critical failure, required an incredible level of precision and quality control. The Zagwan Aqueduct was a lifeline, a man-made river that allowed a massive city to flourish in a semi-arid landscape, a project whose scale speaks to the immense strategic and economic importance of the province of Africa to the Roman Empire. Finally, we turn to the east, to the Hellenistic world that Rome had conquered, a region with its own long and proud tradition of sophisticated engineering. In Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, the mountainous and seismically active terrain pushed Roman siphon technology to its peak. At the city of Aspendos, famous for its astonishingly well-preserved theatre, a spectacular aqueduct system supplied the city's high Acropolis. The final kilometre of this aqueduct is a masterclass in pressure management. The water arrived at the edge of a deep valley and was then channeled down into an inverted siphon. But uniquely, as the pipes ascended the other side towards the Acropolis, they did not feed directly into a ground-level tank. Instead, the water was forced up into two towering, freestanding pressure towers, which were essentially man-made header tanks built as stone pillars. These towers allowed the pressure to equalize and the water level to stabilize before it made the final, short leap across to the Acropolis hill. This complex arrangement, combining a siphon with pressure towers, demonstrates a complete mastery of hydrostatic principles and a willingness to create highly complex, multi-part solutions to solve a specific topographical problem. This tradition of grand hydraulic engineering in the East did not end with the fall of the West. When the Emperor Constantine founded his new Rome at Constantinople in the 4th century, one of the primary tasks was to ensure a water supply that could rival that of the old capital. The most visible and famous part of this new system is the magnificent Valens Aqueduct Bosdoan Chimeri. Completed in 368 AD by the Emperor Valens, this beautiful two-tiered aqueduct, over 900 meters long, marched through the heart of the new capital, supplying its cisterns and baths. The Valens Aqueduct is a crucial link in our story. It represents a late imperial masterpiece, built at a time when the Western Empire was already in deep crisis. It demonstrates that the skills and ambition of the Roman engineers were still very much alive in the East. Furthermore, this aqueduct, as part of Constantinople's wider water system, would be maintained, repaired and expanded by the succeeding Byzantine and, later, the Ottoman empires. It continued to supply the city with water for over 1,500 years, a stunning testament to the durability and brilliance of its original design. It embodies the transition from the classical to the medieval world, the handing down of a vital technology from one empire to the next. From the elegant arcades of Gaul to the raw power of the granite piers in Spain, from the immense distances traversed in North Africa to the sophisticated pressure towers of the East, the provincial aqueducts tell a story of remarkable adaptability and relentless ambition. They were not cookie-cutter copies of the aqueducts of Rome. They were unique solutions to unique local challenges, each one a dialogue between Roman engineering principles and the specific character of the land itself. They prove that the aqueduct was far more than just a piece of municipal plumbing. It was a flexible, powerful, and universal technology that served as one of the primary tools of empire. An aqueduct marching across a provincial landscape was a visible, permanent, and undeniable declaration that this land was now integrated into the Roman world. It brought not just water, but the entire Roman cultural package: the baths, the fountains, the sanitation, the very concept of a well-ordered city. It brought health, it brought comfort, and it brought a new way of life. By conquering the challenges of thirst and terrain in every corner of their vast domain, the Romans truly created an empire of water, a sprawling, interconnected civilization whose most enduring legacy is written not in the annals of war, but in the silent, magnificent stones that once carried the gift of life across the world. Our long journey through the world of Roman aqueducts comes to a close. We have walked in the footsteps of the ancient surveyors, tracing a path of meticulous precision from a distant mountain spring. We have stood in awe before the scaffolding of a great arched bridge, witnessing the symphony of labor that raised stone to the sky. We have followed the water into the heart of the city, seeing how it filled the baths, graced the fountains, and washed the streets, shaping the very rhythm of Roman life. And finally, we have watched as these stone arteries fell silent, only to be rediscovered as timeless monuments to ingenuity. The story of the aqueducts is the story of Rome in miniature. It's a narrative of pragmatic problem-solving, audacious ambition, and a profound understanding of the foundations upon which a great society is built. These structures are more than just impressive ruins. They are a masterclass in civil engineering and public administration. They teach us that the most enduring legacies are often those that serve the fundamental needs of the people. The legions have vanished, the emperors have turned to dust, but the echoes of the water they brought to their city can still be heard, a quiet, persistent whisper of a civilization that, for a time, mastered the art of living well. Thank you for joining me on this journey.